Thank you, Adrian, and I'm very pleased to be here with you in this conference at the MFG in Tokyo and in direct from Paris. I would like to explain in the beginning that this conference was previously organized in presence because I was planning to come to Tokyo to do my field work during the games. So finally, because of the pandemic, it's not possible to me to come in Tokyo. It's why this presentation is an intermediate presentation of the results. We don't arrive to do exactly what we want in the fieldwork. So I'm sorry in advance for some little problem in the result, some little loss in the result. I will share now the. Yes, sorry. So it's good for this. To explain why I decided to make a study about urban experiments during the game, because it's not an evidence in the beginning. So I will explain why this topic in particular. As Adrien explained, I am a coordinator of urban studies program of research in the Fondation France-Japon de l'EHESS in Paris. And concerning this program, we decided to compare the urban strategies of the different global cities. And because we started by studying Paris and Tokyo, we decided to use the games as a way to study the urban strategy. So the games for us are a kind of a bias to find a way to compare the different urban strategy of the global city. And evidently, because of the actuality, because Tokyo is hosting the Olympic Games in 2020 and now in 2021, and Paris will host the games in 2024, we decided to focus for the beginning of this study on these two cities and on their bids for the games. So it's concerning why studying urban experiments at the Tokyo Games, it will be the conference of today. I will focus on Tokyo and not on the comparison of the different global city. I will talk a little bit about that, but it's not the core of this work now. The question is that Tokyo, for the bid of 2020, decided to highlight the technological innovation as the main purpose of the Games of Tokyo. It is not different from the urban strategy of Tokyo, because the Tokyo metropolitan government decided during the 2010s to reinforce its capacity, the abilities of the stakeholder, the urban stakeholder, to promote innovation and experiments in Tokyo. It was the objective to help the Tokyos to find economic growth. So innovation, technological innovation, is seen by Tokyo metropolitan government as a way to promote economical growth. This is the most important point to introduce. During the game, three different innovations were highlighted. It's the robotics, autonomous vehicle, and hydrogen. And I will explain why there's three different fields and from what kind of stakeholder these innovations are implemented during Tokyo Olympic Games. So to explain, I do this slide to explain to you the framework of my research at the Fondation France-Japon. The problem of studying global cities is that this concept is a little bit confused because of the history of this concept. So the concept of global city, to explain briefly, was implemented during the end of the Cold War in the the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s to explain how the most important actor of the economy is not necessarily now the state, the central state. Now in the 90s, not now today, in the 90s was not especially the national state or the central state, but more and more the cities, and particularly the financial big cities, conceived as global city by Saskia Sassen, particularly in his work of the beginning of the 90s. The idea of Saskia Sassen was to demonstrate that 2, 3, or 4 global cities are the leading economical engine of the end of 80s. Saskia Sassen, at the beginning, introduced only 3 cities, particularly New York, London, and Tokyo. Paris was a kind of the fourth city, but was never really introduced by Saskia Sassen, only in an article in 94 when she explained why Paris is not in the top 3 but in the top 4, and why Paris is not under the top 4. It was very particular article because it was a command from a French scientist to understand why Paris was not in the top 3. But this article is important because she explained exactly what she understands by global city. And global city in the beginning of 90s is focused on financial development of the market, so only on the financialization of the cities. And there were no other characteristic to explain what is a global city. So it was a very focused definition. The biggest problem with this concept was it was not so easy to compare the different cities and to explain why one city is a global city and another is not a global city. So after Saskia Sassen, different researchers tried to improve this field. And in particular, it was a problem when we tried to compare the urban strategy development of this city because of the difference of institutional organization between these global cities. I will use an example you can easily understand. For example, the prefecture of Tokyo, the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, for example, is absolutely not comparable with other institutional level in France, or particularly in the case of Paris, because the city of Paris is a very little municipality of only 2 million inhabitants in the central part of the metropolitan area of Paris that is composed by more than 1,000 municipalities. And you can imagine how it's complex to make a comparison with the same materials between the case of Tokyo and the case of Paris. And I only speak of those 2 cities, but we can have the same problem with New York or with London. So the problem we wanted to highlight with this research program in the Fondation France-Japon on urban studies about global cities was to make a kind of update of the different studies made concerning the strategies of urban studies, of global cities, sorry. In the middle of the 2000s, 2 different research were very interesting to the comparison of strategies. It was one in France by a consortium of different professors leading by Christian Lefebvre. This consortium of professors tried to respond to a command of the municipality of Paris to compare the different metropolitan governance in Europe or in the world. And finally, the result of this work, this study of metropolitan and global city governance, was that it was not possible to compare the different urban strategy. Only it is possible to compare the governance of these cities. And this work was very important to understand, to focus on this difficulty in urban studies. The other and very important work on this question is evidently the book of Neil Brenner and Roger Cale, which they tried to make a complete book of comparison of urban strategy of global cities, but the book was have a big limit because finally it was more a monographic approach of the different global city and not a direct comparison of these global cities. So that's the point. It's now how in 2020, how in 2015, exactly when we begin to work on this question, how do we find a way to compare their strategies with the same materials, with the same bias? So the hypothesis we do in the beginning of this project was that Olympic Urban Project. So the Olympic Urban Project is the urban project included in the Olympic bid by cities, candidate cities. So the Olympic Urban Project, because of the IOC constraints, make possible to do a comparison, because I will explain later, but I explain in a few words now. So the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, asked to the different candidate city to read a long document of 3 volumes. It's a very long document and complete document. And inside this document, the candidate city are in obligation to explain the compatibility between the urban plan that existing today. So how the strategy, urban strategy, so with the compatibility of this urban strategy, with the Olympic Urban Project. And this explanation is an obligation. And so it existed in all of the bid for the games. So every candidate city are in obligation to do it. Secondly, we have another point is that after 2008, global cities and big metropolitan area trust the games. So it was Beijing in 2008, London in 2012, Rio de Janeiro in 2016, Tokyo in 2020, Paris 2024, Los Angeles 2028. As we see, it is always global city or candidate to be global city, if we can explain. So for 20 years, there is no regional cities like Barcelona in 92 or Athens in 2004, Athens or Sydney in 2000. So yes, it is a kind of actually a monopoly of the games in global cities. And this point, it is interesting because it is in the same time that the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, face the most important criticism against the organization of the games. In different countries, in different cities, particularly after Athens in 2004, a lot of criticisms appear against the cost of the games, the gigantism, and the social and environmental impact. In the same time, I forget to read that evidently there is a democratic critique against the games organized in Sochi in Russia, or the possibility to have the Qatar games in 2032. So there's different critiques that are very important for the IOC. And during the 2000s and the 2010s, the IOC tried to make a big reform of the bidding system. And the second hypothesis we do is that because the global cities are now trusting the games, these global cities have a strong influence in the bidding reform of the IOC. And this bidding reform have encouraged, are in favor of bidding of global cities and less by metropolitan cities. Regional cities, sorry. So like that, I try to explain the framework of this research. Concerning the postponement, it's evident that we imagined in March of 2020 that the postponement will encourage different criticism against the IOC. For example, why do we build the Olympic Village and different facilities if the games it's not certain to happen? That is a big problem because you spend a lot of money and you are not sure that the game will happen, and we can imagine it's a big critic. But finally, we are not sure that that criticism will appear for long term. So I think it's not an evidence that this postponement is a big problem for the Olympic movement. Actually, so currently, I don't know what we will say in 2 or 3 years when we will have more elements to analyze and study what happened today. But now we can't say that is a problem for the IOC movement. It's more a problem for Tokyo because evidently the IOC preserve itself by contracting a city host contract with Tokyo to be preserved to pay for the postponement. So the question is now the central government of Japan and the Tokyo metropolitan government are really the two only actors to pay for the postponement. The IOC, I think, gave less than 400 million euro for $100 million sorry, for the postponement, but it's very less. It's a very low level of money comparing to the cost of the postponement. So it's not the first time that we can see a kind of a crisis of the Olympic movement. In the 80s, it was the crisis of the boycott. I don't really explain why, but it was interesting that it's not the first time that the IOC is facing the kind of problems with cities, hosting cities. In fact, if we study the Olympic movement from 2000, we can see that the criticisms appear today for the postponement is a long-term criticism, and it's not only critic for Tokyo 2020, but it is a general criticisms against the organization of the games by the IOC. So it's not evident to say that the postponement will be a problem for the Olympic movement. I will explain later why, and I will have more information for that. But and I think as a scientific, it's not easy to analyze what happened today because we don't have all the elements to analyze it, particularly because the IOC is a kind of obscure, dark organization. So we will see if in 20 or 30 years I will give more elements to what happened during the Tokyo Games. And today it's not possible to have a good analysis of what is it. So, sorry, I missed. Yes, what I say for the Olympic movement is more important is the criticisms against the cost and the gigantism. And the real event for the IOC was the simultaneous election of Paris 2024 and Los Angeles 2028 in Lima, in Peru in 2017. These two simultaneous elections was very surprising. It's the first time it happened for the Olympic movement after the Second World War. And it is interesting because it reflects the less attractiveness of the Olympic bids. So there is less and less cities that want to be candidate for the games. This problem was highlighted by two French professors named Nathalie Fabry and Sylvain Zegny. These two professors explain that particularly in Europe, the games have not now a good have not a good image, sorry, and it is why a lot of local government didn't want to be candidates, and it was the case for Budapest, which decided to abandon the candidacy, like Roma in Italy abandoned the candidacy too, because of the cost and because of the political cost. If I say that, there is the budgetary cost and the political cost, and they wanted to be facing a big fail like in Athens 2004. So why this election is interesting for the Olympic movement is that after 2017, there is 8 years without election. So these years, these times, this period will be very important for the IOC to implement the strong reforms they tried to do during the 2010s, named Agenda 2020. And this reform is interesting because it is the first time that the IOC discussed really the possibility to modify the contemporary form of the Olympic Games. So the contemporary form of Olympic Games, it's one host city, have all the venues in one time, in one period, so in 1 month, every event, Olympic events will happen in the same city. And the discussion now is perhaps it is preferable, it is better to have a different host city for the same games. And this is an important question because it opens the doors to the end of the idea of one city, one games. And for me, this reform is more important for the Olympic movement than the problem faced by the postponement. I will explain why during the conference, and we will have other elements. And particularly, it will be interesting for us to see how the Olympic, the IOC, will receive the Qatar's bid for 2032. Because it's in today, we are not sure because Qatar is not officially a candidate, but for 2032, it will be perhaps 2 candidates, New York City, which never have the games, and Qatar. And the choice between the two, or the capacity to the IOC to ask to Qatar to not be candidates, that can be an idea, will be a good answer to the criticisms of the 2000s. If the IOC care or not of these criticisms. So we will see. It's a kind of a little perspective, but it's important point to understand that the Olympic movement have a temporality, very long temporality of work and not game by game. So sorry for this long introduction. Now this is a summary of this conference. I will explain relatively shortly how the Olympic Games works and what is exactly the IOC, the International Olympics Committee. For me, it's a point we don't speak a lot in Olympic studies, but it's very important to understand what is IOC and why it is specific to have the games in a city. The second point will be about the host and candidate city, because it's very important to see the long-term transformation of the Olympic bids, of the city bids and the Olympic bids. After that, I will describe the 2 different bids, Tokyo 2016 and Tokyo 2020. It's very important to make a package because it's Tokyo 2020 is not a one-shot bid. It's the second bid, and this is important to explain the difference between the 2 bids. And at the end, I will explain what in the bid of Tokyo 2020 can be considered as urban experiments and what they try to do concerning the city of Tokyo with these experiments. As I explained, I don't have, unfortunately, I don't have the possibility to come to Tokyo. So it's this presentation is based on official documents of the bid and official documents of the IOC. I don't have the possibility to observe the experiments in Tokyo. In fact, the different experiments wasn't happen in Tokyo because of the postponement. So it's not because I'm not here that I can't observe, but because the experiments didn't happen for a large part. So the IOC, very briefly, because it's not very very important, but the Olympic and Paralympic Games promote cities. It's always the city that is candidate for the games. When I say city, it's literally it's always a municipality who is the candidate. Only one time happened in California for the Winter Games. It was not a municipality, but the state of California, because the games happened in an area without municipalities, because in US there is no municipalities everywhere. So yes, it was the only case, but in general it's a city. So the idea of the Olympic and Paralympic Games is that it is important for local and national government to be accepted by other governments as a credible country to host the games. So it's a question of national matter and local matter, evidently. You can imagine that when you host the Olympic Games, you imagine to have benefits, economic benefits. I will not speak about that today, but the majority of the studies carry out on the question of economic benefits answers that there is no answer now if the games are or not benefit for the cities. So there is no consensus, absolutely no consensus about the benefits of the games. The other point is local and national governments try during the preparation of the games to build a large number of infrastructures in a short period of time with a lot of constraints. And this is a big challenge. It's in the same time an important challenge for international legitimacy, but it is important in a local and national policy to show that the governments and local authorities are able to do that. So always we need to think that Olympic Games is in the same time a local and national and international question. Nowadays, it's important to speak about legacy, because after the 2000s and to answer to the criticisms against the games, the IOC make a very important place for the question of the legacy. So the cities, candidate cities, need to show how they can ensure the maintenance of the different infrastructure built during the games. To the goal, the objective for the IOC is to abandon the ideas that the big infrastructure will be abandoned after the game, like in Rio and like in Athens. So now it's one of the most important points of the Olympic bids, city bids. And the other side of the IOC is the private partners. Private partners pay a lot of money to be partners for 4 or 8 years. And I don't speak about media because the majority of the money, they don't come from the media. The media have a partnership for the games for the 1 month of the games, but the private partners of the games have a contract for 8 or 4 years. It's more longer. And for this private partner, they pay to have access to the different venues and the Olympic Village, and to show their products, their technologies, their services in the front of people who come to the games, but in the same time to use the publicity, the advertisements related to the games. It is important to say that because these partners spend sometimes a lot of money to prepare some products and some technology to be showed, to be exposed during the games. At this question, I will have an answer at the end for Tokyo. I will show you how, in the case of Tokyo, it's particularly Toyota Motor Corporation, which is the most important partner and most visible partner. So to explain, what is the IOC? The Professor Frank Lati from University Paris 13 study what is the legacy, and he explained, sorry, I have a problem. He explains that the International Olympic Committee is a private law organization governed by the Swiss Civil Code and composed not of national government, but of private persons. It is important to understand that initially, the IOC, International Olympic Committee, was created in France by Baron Le Coubertin, very famous, but not important to remember him. But in the beginning, it was implemented in Paris. And after a few decades, they decided to go in Swiss because it was easier to be neutral in Swiss, and it was not easy to be neutral in Paris. So the IOC was implemented near to Lausanne, implanted near to Lausanne, sorry. And in 2000, in November 2000, exactly, the IOC and the Helvetic Confederation, so the Swiss central government, decided to have a contract to stabilize the situation of the IOC. Because the IOC is not exactly an NGO, it is not exactly depending of the UN, as some people imagine that IOC is a kind of a branch of UN. IOC is very confusing. It is not a company, but it is not an association. So, and it is not a public authority or a sport federation. And why Frank Lati explains that is composed not of national governments but of private persons is because in the IOC statutes there is only individuals but absolutely no institutions. After that, IOC decided to have 3 French members, 4 German members. I don't remember the number, but it's a kind of agreement, non-official agreement between the different members of the IOC. But nothing in the code of IOC is an obligation to do a specific place for different countries. So as you see, IOC is not really easy to understand, and it's why it's not easy to study too, because the different documents are not easily accessed. So the games, at the same time, very briefly, the games appeared the modern games appeared in 1896 in Athens, and for every 4 years. And the Winter Games appear in 1924. The first games was in Athens and the second in Paris, and the first games of winter was in Chamonix in France. You can see that the Baron de Coubertin, which was a very strange personage, remain with a very important position in the IOC. It's why France have an important place inside the IOC at the beginning. It's not the case today, but in the beginning it was the case. And finally, the Paralympic Games appeared in 1960 and 1976. And it was later, but in fact, it was important to see that the IOC make a big effort to integrate Paralympic Games very earlier compared to what happened in our governments now about the integration of people with handicap. So the event is composed of more than 15,000 athletes and the same number of people for the delegation. London had 2 million spectators in 2012, but Tokyo imagined to have 15 million spectators. So we can see the size of the number differs between the different countries, and we don't know exactly how many Tokyo should have really spectators for the games in 2020. We will see next year, but the number was important and impressive. There is 30 different sports and more than 300 different events. I say ranging from athletics in stadium, kayaking and equestrian. It's 3 examples to show how many different infrastructure you need to have the games. It's not like the FIFA World Cup where you have 10 stadiums and you can do your events. For the Olympic Games, you are in obligation to have so many different venues for training and for competition. That is a very, very big challenge and perhaps the most complicated and the most expensive mega event in the world currently. So it's not to emphasize, evidently it's not to emphasize the games. I don't want to imagine that I am impressed. It's just to explain that make a comparison between the games and other mega events is really not easy, because it is totally different topic and totally different size of event. As I explained, just to have a kind of a landscape of what was the games, there is, in the history of the games, only 22 hosting cities. And 62 cities were candidates for the last 130 years. So it's not amazing. It's a little club, if we can say that. These candidacy are important to be in perspective of the different continents. Donc I try to make a synthesis here with this table. You can see that European cities are the most represented in the bids after North America, South America, Asia, Oceania, and Africa. It is a big gap between the different continents, and it is interesting to see that the different Tokyo have a particular place in this landscape, because it is a city which is the most have the most concentration of event in his continent. So for Asia, there is 3 hosting cities for 6 events, and Tokyo is the only city to have 3 events. So half part of the games happen in Asia were in Tokyo. That is important to show. And in Europe, it's not the case. Only Paris and London have 3 times the games for 17 success. It's more to indicate you what happened during the bids. And if we focus on global cities defined by Saskia Sassen and the beginning of the definition of what is global cities in the 90s, we can see that excepted for New York, that was only candidate for 1 time, the 4 other big global cities were candidates several times. Los Angeles, particularly, with 10 candidacy, Paris 7, Tokyo 5, and London 4, and for 3 success for every city. And you can see that Tokyo concentrates the more candidacy and the more success in this continent. Just to show you the different the evolution of the candidacies. So in the beginning, it was not a lot of candidacy before 1932. It was an exception in 1936 with many candidacy, and finally it was in Berlin, and we know that it was a complex games for the IOC. And after that, there is a kind of a period with a lot of candidacy before the big crisis of the boycott of the games in the beginning of the 80s. And after this boycott crisis of the games, we see another expansion of the number of candidacy before 2028, where Los Angeles was elected with no concurrent. So it is important to show that it's not, we don't have for every games the same number of candidacy, and it can change a lot. And this table is to show you the host city and the continent. So in the right side for the continent, we see that European continent was really dominating the beginning of the IOC candidacy, and now it's more and more diversified, even if Europe and America is dominated this element. Concerning the host city, I just show you, I put in gray the cities which have already the games. So Paris have the games in 19, and after Paris have the games in 1924. So it's why Paris is in gray. London have the games in the beginning of the 90s, and have the games another time after the Second World War. That's why it's in gray. And as you can see, at the end, at the bottom, you see that the majority of the cities are in gray, and we see a concentration of the candidacy in cities which already have the games. So more and more cities which are successful, which have a success in the election for bidding cities, are cities which have the games one time before, one or more time. In reality, only 4 cities have the games 3 times, so Paris, London, Tokyo, and Los Angeles. And the specificity is Athens have 2 times the games because of the history of the games, because it was implanted in Athens, and it remains the antiquities. So concerning the Tokyo 2016 and Tokyo 2020 games, I will show you that it's interesting today there is different studies who try to show that cities, candidate cities, and countries that are that supported these candidatures make a kind of a cluster of candidatures. So we are not, it's very rare that a city, Olympic city, is a one-shot candidature. Only London in 2012 have this. They were not candidate before 2012, and they have a success in one-shot election. For the other case, it's not the same situation. For example, and it's not only a question of Olympic Games, it's a question of different events, mega events. For example, you see that Tokyo in 2019 has the Rugby World Cup in Japan. And it was important for the IOC because it proves that Tokyo and Japan are able to host a mega event. So in general, IOC is in favor of cities which have already another project of mega event candidacy. So FIFA World Cup, Rugby World Cup, Universal Fair, Exposition Universelle. For example, the candidacy of Osaka for 2025 is not really separated to the candidacy of Tokyo for the Games, because it was important for the Universal Fair committee to see that Japan was trying to have mega events in general. And for the Universal Fair 2025, the other candidate was Paris, because Paris, like Tokyo, have the Rugby World Cup in 2023, the Olympic Games in 2024, and initially they wanted to have the Universal Fair in 2025. So there is a clusters of candidacy. Candidacies are not alone in general. So the 2016 bid was a fail for Tokyo, a Rio win. The context was very different to the context of 2020 bid. So the bid of 2016 was in 2008. In 2008, there is economic stagnation, evidently, aging of population, and the games of Beijing. So the regional concurrence with Beijing was important for the national authority to support Tokyo in the bid. But in fact, it was only, the context was not so specific at this time. And the Olympic urban project was deployed around the Bay Area, so like in 2020, and with the renovation of some of the legacy of 1964 and the construction of a new Olympic stadium that was abandoned in 2020. So the 2020 bid was announced a few months after the earthquake of 2011 in Japan, and so the economy of Japan was not very good at this time, and it was a recession. And in the same time, you have the London Games. So for 2020, the bid of Tokyo was more linked to the question of the reconstruction of Japan, in the narrative way. I don't say that it was important for the reconstruction of Japan, but for the narrative of the bid, it was important. And in the same time, it was a tool to be in concurrence with the other global cities and, for example, with London. And I will show you that in the candidacy and the different documents made by the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, the question of the comparison with other global city is always an important point. So the Olympic Urban Project of Tokyo 2020 is not very different to 2016. The only question is the stadium, because they want to use the old stadium and not to build a new. With a big renovation that cost a lot, but the idea was a renovation. So I show you in this map, I'm sorry, the map is a little bit little, but it's only to show you that there is no big difference between 2016 and 2020. So this map is the different venues of 2016 in the bid. I only use the bid documents now. I don't use the reality, because after some of the place changes after the bid. So now it is the bid document. And you can see if I change now for 2020, there is no big difference. Only two different venues appeared in the east part, but west part. But more generally, there is the same Olympic Urban Project. As I can show you a second time, it's very evident that the Bay Area and the center near Yoyogi and the south of Shinjuku and the north of Shibuya and around the Imperial Palace, some points existed, but it's not very important in terms of urban legacy. But the most important urban legacy of the two candidacy is the Bay Area. So Koto-ku and Shoku. So I'm sorry, it's a little bit dense, and I have a lot of information to give to you, but it's interesting to have this maps before to introduce the question of experiments. So, as I explained, to host the games, you need to have different venues. With the training venues, so you have the events and the training. It makes more than 80 different venues to build or to renovate or to have at disposition for the authorities. In fact, the 2020 Tokyo bid explains that they didn't want to build a lot of venues. They want to use what existed. But when we show how many venues are built temporarily or permanently, we can see that it is not really true that Tokyo have every infrastructure they wanted for the games, but it is a narrative. And I will show that the narrative is very important, because the IOC asked two cities to use what existed and not to build new venues. So Tokyo decided to say that they have the majority of the venues. It's not totally false, but it's not totally true. And it is important to nuance this point. Donc, Tokyo Olympic bids was the Olympic Urban Project of Tokyo 2020 is built with two important conditions. The first is that the majority of the athletes will be at 8 kilometers from the village. I will show you again the map. So the Olympic Village is in the Arumi. I'm sorry, I can't point it in the map, but in the middle of the map. And you know Tokyo more like me, but the problem of this part of the Bay Area is that the connection with the other part of the city is not very good. It is not easy to come from the Bay Area to every part of Tokyo. So the 8 kilometer diameter is really a kind of lie, because they only put in the map around a circle of 8 kilometers, and they say, oh, every athlete will be at 8 kilometers from the village, but only in the map. Because in reality, when you use the bridge and you use different infrastructure of transport, you have absolutely not 8 kilometers from the village to go to your venues. So the narrative is more important than the reality of the Olympic project. And that is a very big point, because you are elected on a project that have not all the different elements the IOC didn't know all the elements you have in the ground. So the games is important for private and public actors because, as I explained, the IOC and the city have a contract, a city host contract. In this contract, the Tokyo Metropolitan Government is in obligation to decrease the number of constraints to use the public spaces. So in the area of the village, Olympic Village, in the area of the different venues, in the celebration area, fan zone that the Tokyo Metropolitan will organize for the games. I say the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, but it's the same for the city of Paris, the city of Los Angeles, the city of London. It's the same contract. So there's different cities are in obligation to change the rules of the public space and the rule of urbanism. And it is a kind of window for different private partners to experiment some of their technology or some of their products. For example, it is possible during the games to use cameras, video security to make a facial recognition that is not possible in a lot of cities. So the games allow to different actors to pass to go beyond the regulation, and that is very important because it means that during the games, during the 1 month of the games, there in the area of the Olympic venues that are contracted with the IOC, there is not the same rules as ordinary. And that is the important point. The other point is there is a lot of spectators come from every country which have very important consumption needs. And so many private actors want to do their publicity, want to showcase their technologies during this period because they know that they will find a lot of people very receptive to this kind of showcase. And it's why many private actors, a very big company as a very little one, spend a lot of money to do experiments during the games. And these experiments can be in different levels. For example, it can be a robot of delivery in the street, or it can be a specific construction method for the village, Olympic Village, or a specific GPS navigation system for the cars or for pedestrian. So you have very, very different possibility to experiment during the games. And it is possible because IOC and the city signed a contract, specific contracts with the games. And these contracts, it's interesting because Tokyo 2020 is the first city to make this contract public. In the past, we don't know, it's very difficult to have access to the London 2012 contract. So Tokyo for that is a kind of a new important point for the researcher in urban studies, in Olympic studies, sorry. And finally, another point when you see the Olympic and Paralympic Games is that there is a lot of experiments around the question of accessibility for everyone, and particularly in Tokyo, which have, after the 2000s, a strong politic of free barrier. So to the idea to improve the access of the different population to transport facilities or transport infrastructures. And during the games, we highlight this question that is not the case in other events. I show you in this diapositive, in this slide, little definition from Carvon and Andrew about what is an urban laboratories, and you can see that it is exactly what happened with the village, Olympic Village. So urban laboratories are defined by by Andrew Carvonen and Van Baas as urban laboratories are at the front line of new economic, cultural, political, and societal configuration in cities. These spaces of innovation and change provide a designated space for experimentation where new ideas can be designated, implemented, measured, and if successful, scaled up and transferred to other locales. I focus on the last point of this definition. It is important to say that during the games, the idea is not only to experiment one robot, for example, one delivery robot. It's to experiment 10 or perhaps 15 of these robots. It is the question of the scale up, because one of the big problems for innovation is not to have a good idea, but is to have the possibilities that this idea became possible to be diffused with many products and with to many places in the same time to be profitable. It's what Andrew Carvonen wants to say with this definition. And the games is a very specific time you can do that. At the same time, Tokyo Metropolitan Government tried to produce a new image of Tokyo, not really a new image, but to renovate the image of Tokyo based on three characteristics: innovation, the first characteristic is innovation, safety and security, and sustainable development. It is, when you analyze the 2016 bid and 2020 bid, you can see easily that, I don't have the good slide here, but it's not problem. You can see that the innovation terms didn't appear in 2016. So it means that the big change between the two candidacies, the two bids, 2016 and 2020, is that innovation is highlighted in 2020 and not in 2016. So Tokyo Metropolitan Government buys some space of advertisement in different media, and I took one in CNN. So they have a specific articles written in CNN, and these articles, sorry, I have a little problem of connection. It come back. Yes, so this article in CNN was named "How Tokyo's Innovation is Surging Ahead of Tokyo 2020 Games," and it was interesting because during this advertisement and all of this publicity made by Tokyo Metropolitan Government in CNN was focused on the comparison between Tokyo 1964 games, which was a real success for Tokyo and Japan, and the Tokyo 2020. So in comparison with the bid of 2016, there is a strong bias in 2020 to compare to 1964. It was not the case in the bid of 2016. I just show you these 2 or 3 different points. It's not very important to read it. So the TMG, Tokyo Metropolitan Government, to improve the application of Tokyo for the games, decided to modify one of his urban planning documents named Creating the Future, the long-term vision for Tokyo. This document was implemented after the fail of Tokyo 2016 and just after the success of Tokyo 2020. So it's a kind of a legacy of the success of Tokyo 2020. And as we can see in this introduction of the documents signed by Yoichi Masuzoe, It's evident that it's not him who wrote it, or I don't know. It's not important to know who exactly wrote this document, but it is published as the document of the Tokyo Metropolitan Government. And so this document is interesting for 2 points. Is that the first point is a comparison of the situation of Tokyo today and 2 different periods. The first is in the 3rd paragraph with the Paris of Haussmann. So the governor of Tokyo compares the work that he wants to do with the transformation of Paris in the 1860 and of the transformation of Tokyo after the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923. So the comparison with the past is more connected to a question of a big transformation of the city after a political change or after a catastrophe. And it was the case for the bid of 2020 because, as I explained, the 2020 bid was just after the earthquake of 2011. And you can see the other point at the right side. He explains that the big problem today is the aging of the population, the declining of the population, and the threat of an earthquake for directly striking Tokyo. And this point is important too because it was absolutely not explained in 2016. So we can see that between 2 different candidacy with the same Olympic urban project, because Tokyo 2016 and Tokyo 2020 have the same Olympic urban project. There is different context you can use for the narrative of your bid. In this document, we can see other elements. I just show you 1 point is about the evolving of infrastructure. It is interesting to see that they want to develop infrastructure for the games. There is a lot of narrative with no constraint in this kind of candidacy or in this kind of document. It's only strategic. They explain what they want to do, but sometimes it seems to be very evident. So it's not easy to study. For example, when they say they want to have a safe bike routes in Tokyo, it's an evidence, and we don't know exactly how many kilometers they want to build of path, cycling path, or if they want to change behavior. So it's not easy to analyze this document. Particularly, I wanted to highlight this point. It's another comparison with Occidental Global City. The governor want to propose the Tokyo Champs-Élysées project. They didn't explain what is it. It's only kind of a comparison to say that they are in the game of the global cities. But the most important in this document, so creating the future, the long-term vision for Tokyo, that is, as I explained, the legacy of the Tokyo bid. There is the strategy 6, leading global city, and the approach 15. So it's not the approach 15 of the strategy 6, it's the approach 15 in general, integrated in strategy 6. I'm sorry, it's not evident when I do that, but it's not so many approach in every strategy. So it is written that spur domestic growth at the global city. And it is interesting because it shows that the final objective in the international context for Tokyo is to be in concurrence with other global cities. And there's other global cities. I show you that they speak about the Paris for the cultural and historical background, but in fact, Paris is not really a concurrent of Tokyo. The real concurrent is New York City and London because of the Tokyo financial center. So the goal of the TMJ is to follow the way of New York City and London. And the other point is they want to improve the capacity of Tokyo to be a leader in technological and innovation by improving the academics and the university cluster in collaboration with companies. And there's 2 points. And at this point, I show nothing new. That global city are in competition with two specific strategies, is the financial center and the research and development field. And finally, this candidacy of Tokyo 2020 that have as motto discover tomorrow explains that the real objective of Tokyo is the same as every global city after Saskia Sassen definition. So financial center and academics. And it is why when we make a kind of inventory of the different construction and the different experiments made by Tokyo during the games, and I only put in this document the experiments proposed in the Tokyo 2020 bid document. So I don't have integrate the other experiments appeared after the candidacy. I will do that after this in the future, but now I don't have the possibility because I can't come in Tokyo. So we can see that there is two important points of the candidacy. It's the infrastructure, the transport, and the accessibility. I say 2 points because accessibility and transport are very close, and it's not two different points. But in fact, you can see at the right side that I put in orange different experiments or construction which are connected to the Tokyo Bay area. So we can see that from a general point of view, the real urban laboratory of the Tokyo Games is around the Bay Area, near to Arumi with the Olympic Village, but with the different venues built in the island of Dream Island. I don't remember the name, but the different the different infrastructure built in the Bay Area. And we can see that is important to show the capacity of the games at this point about the question of Olympic urban project. So this slide is, you know what I want to say with this slide is the postponement decided in 2020 and 2021 made these experiments totally ineffective. It was important to say that what was proposed will be about experiments. I don't say about construction. So the venues existed and the village existed, so they will be used. But concerning the experiments, for example, different robotic or vehicle used for the games during the games, these experiments are ineffective and perhaps will be not maintained. So we don't know exactly the situation of these different experiments. The Tokyo Metropolitan Government, as Toyota Motor Corporation, did not decide today what they want to do with these experiments. In the same time, for the question of robotic and vehicles, the technologies are changing very quickly, fastly, and it is not certain that the experiments of this year should be the same in 2021. The other point is not now clear. It's what happened with the host city contract, the contract for hosting city between the IOC and the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, because the contract is very, very specific, and it's only occurred during the event and not after. So they will now re-sign a new contract, and this new contract will explain what new rules will be less important, or what new rules will be improved during the next games. And we don't know exactly the scenario today. We will have foreign fans or only Japanese fans in the stadium, how the different athletes can come. So it's very confusing, and this contract will be the next step to understand what kind of experiments will stay. But it's important to see that concerning this research project about experiments, it is necessary to to observe what experiments is maintained without the games and what is not maintained. Because if it's maintained, it will say that the experimentators wanted to make the experimentation only in the different infrastructures available without necessarily the spectators and the different people in the street. So, for example, it is possible that Toyota maintain its hydrogen bus in Tokyo without the games, and others will be deleted or cancelled because they are not in a there is no spectators or no many people to make the experimentation, because we don't know exactly what the different stakeholders test in their technology when they experiment it. For example, if you experiment delivery robots, you don't, and I observe it, I observe it in the street. I don't know if the experimentator tests exactly the capacity to the robot to manage an environment of infrastructure, diverse infrastructure without specific control on the pedestrian way and for example, the road, or if the experimentator experiments the capacity of the robot to cross pedestrian. It's very different idea of experiments, and the study of Tokyo 2020 experiments and Tokyo 2021 experiments can explain part of the experimentator's constraint and part of the experimentator objectives. I'm not sure to be particularly clear, but it's a specific point and specific discussion of experimentation studies. So the postponement we will know exactly what happened with the postponement, as I say, at the end of the Tokyo 2020-2021 games. So we don't know exactly what happened today, and it's too difficult to say if the postponement will have a strong or not impact of the experiments in Tokyo. And I will answer to you another time for when I have the answer on this point. So, in conclusion, it's always complex to have a conclusion of this kind of research that is partially stopped by the COVID, but I will try to do a first conclusion. So this, when analyzing the urban strategies of Tokyo and the Olympic urban project of Tokyo 2016 and 2020, we can see that there is a strong link between the two, and Tokyo Metropolitan Government use the games as a tool to accelerate and to improve its own strategy. It is not sorry. It is not like in the games of Barcelona 92, where you have a huge construction in the city and that change the face of the city. In Tokyo 2020, the idea is not to change profoundly the city. So it is only to improve and to accelerate the urban strategy existing. And as Raphaël Languillon explained in his text produced for the IOC, not the IOC, but the Olympic Study Center, that Tokyo 2020 was used as an insurance for a part of the building for the real estate construction in Tokyo. Tokyo wanted to increase the number of tourists, and about this point we are certain that it is not possible to know the answer of this question. We never know if Tokyo 2020 was a success or not on this point without the COVID. The improvement of the accommodation facilities for hotel, because the Tokyo Metropolitan Government have from a long time the will to follow the same way as the big other global city in the tourist way. So it's connected to the number of tourists, but they wanted to have more hotel and more accommodation facilities for a foreigner. And at the end, this study show how it is important for Tokyo in 2020 to improve the international attractiveness in R&D and in research and development. And this is the most important point that we can have between comparing, 2016 bid and 2020 bid. There's two bids show us the difference of strategy after the two different contexts. So the context of 29 and 2011. I think I will finish at this point. It is not new. I don't have really new results on this point, on the other point, and I will give you. I will let you read the work of other important researchers on the question of financialization of the real estate in Tokyo, or about the question of recentralization and reconcentration of housing around the hub by Natasha Avin for financialization, and Sophie Bunick for the question of recentralization and reconcentration. I will improve no point in this field. Another point is I don't say that the 2020 Olympic Urban Project is focused on the Bay Area, and it is not new strategy for the TMJ. So as Remy Scott-Chimaro shows in the past, that the Bay Area is a focus now for the TMJ and the national government to accelerate the construction of new real estate with high standing buildings in near to the Tokyo center, and to make a renovation of the old industrial and harbor facilities that are now not used, well, or not used as the TMJ wants, because it's two different points. And I will let you read what Remy Scott-Chimaro read on this question. It will be more interesting than what I say today for the renovation. And finally, if I can make a first conclusion of the experiments, it's that the Tokyo 2020 have not big ambitious about the infrastructures or about the different work they have done in 1964. And the two different bids make a lot of reference to 1964 and explains that it's not the time today to build a big infrastructure. So the only important construction made for Tokyo 2020 is finally to connect the Bay Area with better road and transportation system to the rest of Tokyo. And perhaps that will be the big legacy of Tokyo 2020, is to have connected is a new land reclamation with the center of Tokyo. But with one point, I am not sure that it will be a good legacy, is the increase of public transport is not important. And we can see that only the bus line of hydrogen bus line is a legacy of the games, or some cycling and walking path. I will wait for the next year to come to Tokyo with different professors from the University of Tokyo to study exactly the improvement of cycling and walking paths, to know if it is or not a legacy of Tokyo 2020. It is not possible now to me to conduct this part of the research. So it will be another point, important point of my future stay in Tokyo if I have the possibility. And another point was important for the Tokyo committee was to install inside Tokyo in the marathon course different temporary installation to fight against the heat wave. It was important because they wanted to test and to experiment in the street of Tokyo different technique to decrease the heat waves in the summer to allow the marathon course to happen. And finally, with the Doha, I don't know if you know, but in Doha it was a marathon 2 years ago, and it was a big fail because majority of the athletes abandoned during the course because it was too hot. And the IOC and Tokyo Metropolitan Government decided to move the marathon course in Sapporo, in the north of Japan, to have no problem with the heat wave in the summer. So it is another point interesting to analyze if Tokyo Metropolitan Government maintain the construction of these experiments to fight the heat wave or not in the streets of Tokyo. So, strictly speaking, actually, there is no urban laboratory without the games. So, with the report, the urban laboratory, with the postponement, the urban laboratory was abandoned. So, we wait to know what kind of new urban laboratory will emerge with the new contract signed by IOC and the Tokyo Metropolitan Government for 2021. And the other difficulties is with the postponement, there is a total abandon of the systematic measurements of the different points of the venues. So measurements about the people who come, but for all the different elements that the IOC want to measure, and that is a necessary point to be a urban laboratory. You can't have urban laboratories without systematic measurement of every characteristic of the event, every characteristic of the different traffic, different people who use this or this service. So without these measurements, the urban laboratory will not happen, and it's why it's complex to speak of urban experiments in Tokyo 2020 without with the postponement. This point I explained earlier, so I only give you the bibliography. And I will let you give me some question. I don't see if there is in the chat some question or not.